This month marks 40 years since I first set foot on the old front line. When I look back over those 4 decades, what was that first trip like? What's it like to have worked as a battlefield guide, to have lived on those battlefields? And what are some of my favourite places? I've just returned from the We Have Ways festival. This is a festival organised by the We Have Ways podcast community, a podcast about the Second World War by Al Murray and military historian James Holland. And I know many of you who listen to the Old Front Line listen to that as well. It's a different war, a different conflict. But what was really great was to meet so many of you who listened to this podcast at that festival. A real community, sense of community there amongst the people that we met over the course of the weekend, and a real dedication and passion for the history of not just the Second World War, but the wider aspects of conflict in the 20th century. And I can't say enough thanks really to those of you who took time to come over to our Ledger Battlefield stand and come and talk to me about how much you enjoy this podcast and where you listen to it and what you get out of it and some ideas for future podcasts. That was really great to meet so many of you over the course of that weekend. And I think that what events like that show is just how vibrant, how important military history is to a wider public. And the level of engagement with history, I think, has never really been any higher than it is at the moment, born partly out of the lockdown period, which gave birth to this podcast and so many others, but I think continues way beyond that. I think podcasts and the wider interest in history is becoming a mainstream thing, and that, again, is a really positive thing to have come out of this last few years. And I think going forward, what it means is that interest in both these conflicts will grow. And anyone who studies them will know how they don't exist in isolation, how they cross between each other on so many occasions, as we have discussed on this very podcast quite a few times. And going to the We Have Ways festival made me think as well about our own little community here. We've got another supporters meeting coming up this weekend to tie in with the 105th anniversary of the Third Battle of Ypres, the Battle of Passchendaele, and we're going to have a chat about some aspects of that, look at some photographs, and open the meeting up to some questions for people to be able to ask about that battle and the wider aspects of the First World War. And going forward with our Old Frontline supporters community through Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee, I'm very grateful to all of you who support the podcast in that way, but I'm aware that we're entering a period of tough times in many respects in terms of an economic downturn. And so please remember that you support the podcast just by listening to it. And it's not a case of just by listening to it. Listening to it is really important, and I really enjoy your feedback. So all of you are part of that wider community, and I hope to do a few things for the wider community as we go forward. For those who do support via Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee, I'm going to look at some additional benefits coming towards this autumn, one of which I hope will be a regular newsletter to talk about what's going on the old front line and look at some images connected to the Great War and some other aspects of the history of the First World War as well. And quite a few of you over the course of the last weekend asked me about the idea of a meet-up on the battlefields or a battlefield tour. This year has been extraordinarily busy for me in terms of the rebirth, really, of battlefield tours following the pandemic. And I found myself pretty much too occupied to be able to organise our own trip, but I've got one in the pipeline for next year. And what I'm aiming to do is to have a trip which we'll organise through Ledger Holidays, and if possible as well, a meet up on the ground for those who can't make a battlefield tour but want to meet up and do a walk across a bit of the Western Front. Now, more of that, again, I hope, through the newsletter, through the autumn period, to announce some dates for those for 2023. I'll keep you posted. Now, this coming weekend would have marked 40 years of me going to the Western Front battlefields, and I had a trip planned with my old school friend Andrew, who was with me on that very first trip. But I managed to break my finger when I was out on a battlefield tour. Not just break it, but dislocate it as well, and ouch, that was rather, and still is, rather painful. So I'm not making that trip, and I had hoped to do another live broadcast from the battlefields for a supporters evening. We'll put that off for another day. But what it means is that rather than record this out there, I'm doing it from home. But that's what we're about to do. We're about to look at 40 years on the old front line and look back over some of the things that I've done and some of the places that I've been. And also, quite a lot of you asked me, there's some of my favourite locations as well. So as always, although it's not a specific journey this week, we'll strap on our walking boots, our virtual walking boots and our virtual pack and head out to the battlefields of the Great War. I'm often asked where my interest in the Great War began, and really it's been there for most, if not all, of my life, one way or another. Both my grandfathers were in the Great War. Alex Marquitas joined as a soldier in the Rifle Brigade in 1918, right at the end of the war, and then transferred to the regular army, serving right through to Dunkirk in World War II. And my other grandfather, Bertie Samuel Reid, was a regular in the Royal Navy. He joined up just after the Boer War and served at Gallipoli and various other naval engagements throughout the First World War. Now, I never really knew them. One died before I was born and one died not long after I was born. So they weren't people that I knew, but I knew of their stories through the wider family. And with my dad as a veteran of the Second World War, he fought at Anzio, which is one of those places that during World War II was very similar to the experience of the Great War, with trenches and static warfare, barbed wire, night patrols and so on. There was always that aspect of military history, and in particular the two world wars, spinning around in the background of my life. But probably more than anyone else, not my dad, not my grandfathers, but my grandmother, who was a young girl in Colchester during the Great War. That's where it really began, I think, to get personal in many respects, because she had a brother and a number of cousins who were part of her young life, and they'd all worked on the rivers of Essex or on the land, agriculture in Essex. And despite when we watch Downton Abbey, it appears to be a golden age, the period before the Great War, for ordinary working class people, that experience was very different. There was a lot of shortage of work, and with no benefits, men like that often joined the army, and that's what they all did. Some joined the territorials and then went into the regular army, or others went straight into the regular army by joining the local regiment, the Essex Regiment, up the road at their depot. So for her, her brother and her cousins, her generation, marched off to war in 1914, and only her brother returned. And he returned, my Uncle Dan, after 4 years in the trenches, serving on the Western Front and at Gallipoli, having been wounded 3 times and gassed. It changed their world. And for her, these lost cousins, she spoke of them so often as real people to me. Obviously, they had been real people, but she spoke about them so fondly and so often that they became just as real to me. And anyone of my generation growing up in the shadow of World War II, as I've said, conflict was always there, but in our popular culture as well. So the comics that we bought had stories of the First and Second World War in particular for me, Charlie's War in Battle comic, which is the story of a young British Tommy going to war. Incredible artwork, incredible stories, not always historically correct, and we're going to look at Charlie's War in a podcast one day. But for me, it had a massive impact on my young mind and really helped cement my interest in the First World War. I learned so much. There were so many pathways into the war through that comic. But not just what I read, but what we played with. Airfix kits, Tamiya kits, model aircraft. I mean, you name it. It was all part of our lives. And the First World War in particular always resonated with me. In the days when we had really good public libraries, and in Crawley, the new town where I grew up, had a fantastic library, I used to go in there and absolutely devour the books that they had on the First World War. So it was always there. And then when I went to secondary school, and I've mentioned them several times, I had 2 really good teachers, Roger Bastable and Les Coates. Roger Bastable, a local historian, but had a particular interest in the First World War, and Les Coates was a geographer, but he'd written 2 books for students on the First World War, one on Ypres and one on the Somme, both of which are still in print, still used by students all these years later. And through them, I was able to get to the battlefields for the first time in July 1982. So after years of reading about the First World War, thinking about the First World War, having these images of what the First World War was like, finally I had a chance to reach out and touch that history, something that battlefield tours give you, by going on this school trip to Ypres. And I remember coming down the road from Popperinga towards Ypres. They'd driven across country from Calais as we crossed over on the hovercraft in the days when you could do that. And we'd driven in the school minibus down the back roads of France. Now I know through the old villages which the British Army had used as training areas and billets. Then I wasn't aware of that, but we took that road from Popperinga towards Ypres, and in the distance we could see the spires of Ypres. And I remember looking out into a field as we got closer to the battlefield area, expecting to see trenches in the fields as if the landscape had never recovered, but recovered it had. And that was one of the interesting things for me, was to observe how the landscape had changed since the war, but how it still spoke, how it still gave up its secrets. And that was something that I saw even over the course of that very first trip. And the first place that we stopped on that tour was at Hopstore Cemetery at Vlamertinghe, on that road between Popperinga and Ypres. That was my first Great War cemetery, so will always have a special place in my heart, really, that cemetery, because that was where I first stepped into a silent city and saw the names and the headstones and the personal inscriptions on those headstones. This was another pathway, a pathway into understanding, into connecting with that Great War generation. And we stopped there because Les Coates had done some research on a lad from East Grinstead, which was a town not far from us, who'd been killed and was buried in the cemetery. But there was also another local lad from Horsham, just up the road from us, who was buried there as well, who died with the Royal Army Medical Corps, Private Jupp. Hopstore Cemetery is an interesting one because it was a behind-the-line cemetery. The Hopstore, which was then in quite a decrepit state when we visited in 1982, but the old Hop sign painted still on the front of it was pretty much unchanged since the Great War, had been used as a dressing station, in particular during the Third Battle of Ypres in 1917, where, as I would read later through the works of Henry Williamson, based on some diaries of a soldier who was there in 1917, the wounded were laid out across the road in front of the Hopstore, awaiting treatment and awaiting evacuation further down to the casualty clearing stations around Popperinga. So it's a special cemetery for me, Hopstore, because of that early connection, and I've continued to have connections with it today. I have the medals of a local South Yorkshire miner from Thurnscoe, one of the villages just beyond Barnsley, who was killed serving with the York and Lancs, attached to the tunnelling companies in the Ypres salient in 1916, and he's buried in the cemetery there, and I've visited his grave on a number of occasions as well. And it's nice to have these connections. I always feel that when you've got something, a photograph or a medal or a memorial plaque to somebody in one of these little cemeteries or in one of the bigger ones, then you've got a connection to that place in a more definitive way, in a more tactile way, because you own something connected with that soldier who is buried there, and that makes a visit to that location even more special. But we continued on our tour, not just in the areas behind the lines. It was a great few days on that very first trip, which is really definitely cemented in my mind as the impact that it had on me. And we went to Sanctuary Wood Trench Museum, going through, putting our boots on and going through the muddy trenches and walking through the tunnel there in the half darkness and splashing around. It was really as if history was coming alive. And when I've done battlefield tours with students as an adult battlefield guide, I've always thought of just what that first visit meant to me, and I've hoped that they've got as much out of it as well. But it wasn't so much Sanctuary Wood that had the impact on me in terms of trenches. Obviously, being interested in the First World War, trenches are what we want to see when we go on a trip like that. It was Crunaart Wood that really had the biggest impact on me, because it was exactly what a trench museum should have looked like. Now, I know now that the trenches that we saw there were fake. They'd been dug by the owner. There were some original bunkers in there, and it is what today is known as Bayenvalts, just up there on the Messines Ridge near to Witcharter, where a group of archaeologists reconstructed the trench system there using the original methodology and materials and so on. But what we saw in the 80s was a private museum with a little canteen, a soldier's canteen, as the owner, André Beckard, called it. And we've done an episode on Bayernwärts in the podcast. If you go back through the archives, you'll find it. It's where Hitler fought in 1914. And going there and seeing this kind of decrepit little canteen full of Great War material. And when you went in, you paid your, I think it was 50 Belgian francs to go in. You were given a little ticket. And André Beckard had a shell case from a Big Bertha shell, massive, great big brass shell case, full to the top with shrapnel balls. And when you gave him your ticket, he scooped his hand in there and he gave you a little handful of polished shrapnel balls. And it was like receiving the crown jewels to a young teenage historian fascinated with the Great War. And I still have those shrapnel balls, which I keep in a little box as part of my treasures of the Great War. And going into the trench system there and seeing these narrow, kind of decrepit, falling apart trenches, looking at the bunkers, seeing the huge piles of Great War detritus everywhere. When I look back on it, this was exactly what I'd been looking for in this trip. To come to trenches, to walk through these muddy ditches, to touch history, to see the objects, to go in bunkers. This, I now realise, was exactly what I needed to fuel this interest that I'd had. A kind of interest that was not going in any particular direction. I'd read a lot of books, I'd thought about it. Now, the whole of the Great War seemed to come together and had reached a crossroads with me, a crossroads that would take me down a new path, and that's exactly what this trip was about. But it wasn't just in the trenches. As I mentioned, the landscape. In those days, the area around the bluff, which is now the Paling Beek Nature Reserve, wasn't planted with trees as it is today. It was open farmland. And our teachers took us up onto that area of the battlefield where there were some small cemeteries. And I'm forever grateful for them to not just taking us to places like Tynecott and Bedford House. They took us to the small locations as well. And that gave me an appreciation of how important they are and how you connect to those and where their place in the story lies. And walking out across that farmland in 1982, the ground had been ploughed. And in the fields there was the detritus of the Great War. We began to pick up cartridges and shrapnel balls of our own that we'd found. And one of the students picked up the canister, the top of a German stick grenade, a potato masher, threw it thinking it was a Coke can at the teacher and asked, "What is it?" And this grenade, I remember seeing it go through the air and land at the feet of the teacher, who with a rather shocked look reprimanded the student for having thrown it in his direction. But what it showed is that the landscape was still evolving, that there was a past here, a Great War past, and a future, but the present was also connected to the past. It was as if the last page of the past was yet to be turned, perhaps would never be turned. And that's something that we've talked about here on this podcast many times, and I'm absolutely sure now that will be the case. The last page of the Great War will probably never be turned. So what effect did that trip have on me? I think it was one of those moments in my life where I realised that my life would never be the same again. The Great War was not just words on a page, it was a realisation now. I'd seen it. I'd travelled to those battlefields. I'd walked in trenches from what was then 70 years before. I'd picked up the detritus of the conflict in the fields, and I'd seen the messages that families had left on the headstones. Something in me had changed, completely changed, and was about to take me on a path that I continue along to this day. And going to Ypres was not enough. It was not enough just to have gone to Flanders that once. I knew that I needed to return. And I came back and on my teacher's recommendation sought out Lynn MacDonald's, they called it Passchendaele, and read that from cover to cover, and then went to the second-hand bookshops of Brighton and found some more books. And the summer holidays was just about to begin, and I persuaded my father to take us across to the Somme, because having seen Ypres, the Somme was the next obvious place to go to. And we took the ferry across from Newhaven to Dieppe, the train down to Amiens. We changed for Albert, and I remember on that train journey coming into Albert, in my rucksack was Rose Coombs' Before Endeavours Fade, that fantastic guide to the whole Western Front, which was like our Bible in those days. And having devoured that, I knew what lay ahead. As the train turned towards the town of Albert in the distance, I could see the sun glinting on the basilica, the tower of the basilica, with the golden figure of Mary on top, with her outstretched arms holding the infant Jesus. And I was probably, as a teenager, disappointed not to still see it at its 90-degree angle, as the leaning Virgin, as the Golden Virgin, known to those troops of the Battle of the Somme in 1916. And in Albert that summer we stayed in the Hotel Basilique, in the main square opposite the basilica. And from there, with no car, we went off and we walked. And my dad was a Second World War veteran. He was retired by then, but he was fit and active, and off we went and we walked one day from Albert up to La Boisselle, to Pozières, to Thiepval, across to Hamel, and then down through the Avalui Wood and back into Albert. Quite some journey. And on other days we went up to the Newfoundland Park and across towards the area around La Boisselle and Fricourt and Mametz. It was fantastic. We couldn't go everywhere, but again, there was this visualization, reaching out and touching the history of the Great War, finding even more in the fields of the Somme compared to at Ypres. And of course what I now know is that Ypres, almost picked bare by people after the war for scrap, the Somme, left as it was, has far more secrets just beneath the soil. And I remember on that early trip seeing steel helmets in the corner of a field, and water bottles and bayonets, barbed wire pickets, even more in profusion then being used as fence posts. Again, it was as if the Great War somehow had not quite ended, that the echoes of it were still very strong there, not just in the cemeteries, not just in the memorials, but on that landscape. And I often talk about the landscape of the Great War on this podcast, and I think for me that was the genesis of my connection to it, my understanding of how important it is to recognise that landscape and recognise its importance in the wider aspect of our understanding of the Great War. I also noticed on the wall of the Hotel Basilique a poster for an organisation called the Western Front Association, and the address of its founder, John Giles, at Gilton Mill, Porton Lane, Ash, near Canterbury. And when I got back from that trip, I wrote to him and applied to join. And John Giles, a fantastic guy, wrote this really enthusiastic letter back to me saying how delighted he was that one of the new generation had shown an interest in the Great War, and he was delighted to welcome me as a new member to the Western Front Association. And when I came to my first meeting, which was coming up soon in London, I was to come up to him and say hello. So when I went with my dad to the next meeting, not only was John Giles there, but there was about 20 or 30 Great War veterans. There was a talk by Charles Carrington, who wrote The Subaltern's War. Lynn MacDonald was there, and some of the other veterans who became very good friends of mine in the following years were there as well. And John Giles couldn't have done more for me. He introduced me to Richard Dunning, the owner of the Lochnagar crater that I'd seen on my trip that summer. And Richard had just published a new edition of John Giles's Ypres Then and Now book, and I was able to get a copy through him. These people showed such kindness and such help, and really could not do enough for me, really. And not just me, they were like that with everyone. And I think it was a different kind of organisation then. There was a different spirit amongst the people of the Great War back then, something that I try to continue through this podcast. And I know many of you who listen to it feel the same way. And that there's a lot of generosity out there even today, walking around the battlefields, helping each other out on Twitter and other aspects of social media, and that can only be a good thing. The comradeship of the trenches was something important to the veterans, and I think the comradeship of those early Great War battlefield pioneers like John Giles and Lynn MacDonald and Rose Coombs and Richard Dunning and all of those others, that was just as important and is still as important even today. So that trip changed me in so many ways. Whether it was destiny or otherwise, here I am 4 decades later, just as excited, just as enthusiastic, just as connected with the history and the battlefields of the Great War as I was when I set my first steps on that old front line as a teenager in 1982. My interest in the Great War was and will always be a personal one, but it became a professional one as I moved into adulthood. I'd studied history at university, and then I did a master's degree in London while I was working there, and my specialist's research topic for my master's was about black soldiers in the British Army in the Great War, something that we've looked at in a previous podcast. But one of the things that began to happen when I visited the battlefields regularly, and living in Sussex, being only 90 minutes from the port, I could get across on a regular basis. In the days when newspapers ran cheap trips, we could go across to France for the day for £1. We used to regularly go across to the Somme or Ypres or the Forgotten Front between Arras and Armentières to look round those battlefields. So I found myself going there again and again and again and building up this knowledge of what was there and what there was to see. And people would say to me, I'd like to go and see the Somme, will you take me there? So I'd go with a few friends in a car and then a minibus, and then it grew and grew. And in 1987, when I was still a student, I did my first paid battlefield tour when I took a dozen members of the Henry Williamson Society across to the battlefields for a week with my old pal Brian Fulliger. And we did a double act. I was the historian, he was the literary expert, and he did the readings, and we took them around looking at places connected to Henry Williamson's war, to the aspects of the Great War that he'd written about, and Brian did readings from his books and from his other writing. So this was a great bit of experience, and I went on from there after university to start doing my own battlefield tours, using coaches, taking coach groups across, and that grew and grew until a point where, for various reasons, it became impossible to do. And then I found myself going across to France for 3 months, having decided that I was going to write a book called Walking the Somme, because at that point no one had written a walking guide to the battlefields of the First World War. So I'd packed not a virtual knapsack, they didn't exist in those days, but an actual one, gone across and stayed on the Somme battlefields for 3 months and walked the ground and did the research for my book, expecting to only stay there for 3 months, but in the end, effectively, I remained in France for well over a decade, moving to Courcelette with my family. And then in 1996, while I was living at Courcelette, I was approached by the directors of a company called Leisure Travel, as it was in those days, Leisure Holidays now, to set up a First World War battlefield tour for them for the following Easter. Just a 4-day tour, staying at Tournai in Belgium, having a day at Ypres and a day on the Somme. Now, they didn't think there'd be a massive amount of interest in this. They advertised 6 dates and they told me they expected 3 or 4 of them to sell. It was £89 for 4 days, staying in a 3-star hotel in Belgium and seeing the 2 key British battlefields of the First World War on the Western Front. At that time, there were other companies doing battlefield tours, but they charged a lot more than that. And I think Leisure were not prepared for how much interest there was, because those 6 dates in the end turned into 13 departure dates with a minimum of 2 or 3 coaches on each one. And in my original team of Leisure guides, it included several friends, including my old pal John Dray, who I often talk about on this podcast, a veteran of Monte Cassino, fascinated, obsessed, just like me, with the Great War, and who was able to come along and give the benefit of his incredible knowledge and his experience with veterans to our groups in those early days. So this was my first proper venture into battlefield guiding. I'd done it for myself on a small scale, but this was commercial battlefield guiding, commercial tourism. And it's something that I've worked in ever since. This year marked 25 years of working as a battlefield guide for Leisure Holidays. And in that time, I've done, to be honest with you, I don't know how many tours, but it's well over 800 tours for them, covering just about every kind of battlefield from the Waterloo period through to Cold War in Western Europe, with obviously a big predominance of tours being about the First and Second World War. And I'm often asked, how do you become a battlefield guide? A few people at the We Have Ways Festival came to see me about this at the weekend. There isn't really a set route. I mean, first and foremost, this has got to be your passion, your obsession, whatever you're going to call it. You've got to live and breathe the subject. And for me, the way into it was by naturally visiting battlefields, researching battlefields, understanding battlefields, and then wanting to convey that to other people, friends, and then a wider audience. And this is what I always say to people, get that experience of talking. I used to volunteer to give talks at Western Front meetings and Orders and Medals and family history groups and all that kind of stuff. And now you've got opportunities to do that with organisations in your local area. You could work as a volunteer for the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, for example, and do some of their cemetery tours. So there's lots of opportunities to get experience in talking to groups, and that's really important. But first and foremost, you need to read. You need to read every book you can find on the subject and then some. Keep reading, understanding it, the general picture, the view from the trenches, the view of the ordinary soldier, the latest historical thinking in terms of academic research. That's always useful to tap into as well, to understand how the historiography of the Great War has changed over time. It never stays still, and going back to that last page of the war being turned, that's very much a part of that aspect of Great War study. So you need to read continuously, do your own research, pick on particular things that interest you, do research in archives, research individual soldiers, research units, research particular battles in great depth, get to know the battlefields, and then visit those battlefields and look at them layer upon layer, examine the landscape, walk the landscape, drive the landscape, look at what is there, look at the trench maps, use Linesman, that fantastic bit of kit that uses GPS with trench maps to show you what the landscape looked like during the war itself in terms of the layout of the trenches. Bring all of this together into your understanding. So, I mean, you can see already this is not a quick process. You just can't go on a course. You just can't read one book. You need to be committing yourself to this over some time. And many people come to want to work for us, for example, at Ledger, with some of these skills already, because the next stage of it, once you've got the interest, once you've got the ability to understand the landscape and project that landscape to a modern audience so that they can understand it, the next bit is the people skills that you need, and that all comes with life experience. Dealing with people, understanding people, managing people is a big part of working as a battlefield guide. And somebody, again, at the We Have Ways Festival came up to me and said, I've noticed that a very high proportion of your battlefield guides are former police officers. And that's true. We've probably got former police officers more than we have former soldiers in our ranks of battlefield guides. And there's no kind of coincidence in that they come from a background where these kind of skills are part of their professional life, and it's really important to have those. So there's really no quick way into this, and post-COVID, who knows if there is enough work for legions of battlefield guides. That's only time will tell, really. But I think the skills that people learn as a battlefield guide and the amount of work and commitment they put into it has a wider application as well, because it comes down to how we as individuals, as enthusiasts for the history of the Great War, use those skills to connect ourselves to the landscape of the First World War. And one of the things that certainly I learned from people like John Dray and Tony Spagnoli, another Great War guru who in the early days of the Western Front Association was so important and wrote himself a number of books on the First World War, what they would do in the days before guidebooks was take memoirs of the Great War, like Robert Graves' Goodbye to All That, or Siegfried Sassoon, or Frank Richards' Old Soldiers Never Die, and the multitude of others, and then they would go out and they would read those books, make some notes, choose some of the areas that are mentioned in the books, and then walk that ground with that book in hand. Now, we've kind of done that with the podcast, with the Books and Battlefields episodes, and no doubt we will do some more of those further down the line. But I think it's a good way, because it takes a memoir, a soldier's perspective of a battle or a period of the war, and you're then translating that onto the landscape as it is today. And then you can use that then to explain the history of that landscape, which today is open farmland of the Somme or the flat, low ridges around Ypres. You can use that to explain to a new audience who is seeing that for the first time. So it's kind of building up these skill sets in terms of if working as a battlefield guide is a thing that you want to do. But in terms of my own career, if you like, as a battlefield guide, certainly over those 25 years of Ledger, it has changed. I mean, the tour that you do first is never the tour that you're doing now. You continually, if you're committed to it, you continually evolve the way in which you present the history of the Great War. And certainly one of the things that I found following doing this podcast is the way that I've thought about the war and the way that I've verbalised the war, I know has changed. And I've seen that in the tours that I've done recently, and the themes that we talk about, not just the specific history of that particular location, but then the wider aspects of things like war trauma and the experience of war on the survivors, and looking at the families of the men who were killed and are buried in the cemeteries that we visit. What was it like for them? How did they deal with the outcome of that grief and the terrible loss of someone so close to them? How do we see that reflected in the way that these men were memorialised? All of these kind of subjects. And I think that that's the beauty of it, really, because it's endless. The way you can explain the Great War, the way that you can get people to engage with the Great War is endless. And there's no set way of doing any particular tour. And in my team of guides, when you could travel with us Monday to Friday for 4 or 5 weeks on the trot and do the same tour with us, the same tour on paper, but have different battlefield guides each time, and essentially you'd be doing a different tour because each guide brings their own interest, their own perspective, and that is part of what history is, really. And it makes tours that we do again and again different for us. And the other difference, I think, as well as having worked as a battlefield guide over all these decades, is what makes tours special are private visits, special requests. Someone comes to you and says, I want to go and visit a particular grave or a particular location. That's not uncommon as well. And I mentioned in a podcast I did about Portesa Burial Ground Cemetery, on the very first Ledger Battlefield tour that I did, I had a gentleman sitting behind me who tapped me on the shoulder and said, do we go to Portesa, Pogizzi on this tour? I said, not particularly, but what's your interest? And he said, well, my father is buried there. And of course, we've got to go there then. So we went there and I took him to the cemetery, and this is in the pre-internet days, which I know for many people is difficult to comprehend, where you couldn't just look someone up online. And this particular cemetery had a visitor's book and a register, and he wasn't entirely sure where his father was buried within it. So I said, what we'll do, we'll go in there together and I'll go and get the register and we'll find out where your dad's buried and we'll go to his grave. And as we came through the main gate of the cemetery, he just immediately peeled off and went straight to his father's grave. So I left him to it, got his family in, and they had some quiet time there to reflect. And later on that day, I said to him, how come you were able to go straight to your dad's grave? And he said, well, I actually visited it before in the 1920s when it was still a wooden cross. And he said, although I've only got dim memories of that, something impelled me to go in that direction. I knew instinctively where my dad's grave was, and it took me straight to him. What an incredible visit that was. And that was typical of the many trips like that I did in those early days with Ledger, in that we had lots of people whose fathers had died in the Great War. Another one that I think I mentioned in the live stream that we did from the Menin Gate, a chap who'd served in 21st Army Group in the Royal Army Service Corps, going up to Arnhem to take part in Operation Market Garden, September 1944. His dad had been killed in the Ypres salient during the Great War, and he knew he was on the Menin Gate, and he knew roughly where he was. Again, he'd been there as a boy, but only had dim memories of it. And as the trucks were going through Ypres, he suddenly realised that they were in Ypres, and they went out through the Meninstraat, under the Menin Gate, and he jumped out the back of his truck. He ran over to the panel where his dad was listed and was able to see his dad's name just as the trucks were disappearing off up the road. So he ran after the trucks, jumped back in again, and went off to take part in the rest of his Second World War. And then he came back with me in the late 90s to see his dad's name properly on the Menin Gate. And those early years of guiding with Ledger, it was a great privilege, really, to meet people like that, to hear the stories of their father, what it had meant to their family to lose him in the Great War, and what it felt like to return, to see a name on a panel, to stand in front of a grave. Those days have gone now. I mean, I think Richard Van Emden has found recently someone still alive whose father was killed in the Great War, but that link with that generation who suffered that kind of loss in itself, just like the generation of the Great War, has almost gone. One of the more memorable tours that I did in the summer of 2000 was when a group arrived at the hotel we were using, and the first half of the coach got off, and they were all wearing blazers with the same regimental tie, the same regimental badge, which was the badge of the Royal Hampshire Regiment. And the group leader came up to me with an attaché case in his hand, and he said, we've got a bit of a problem. There's an extra member of our group, and furthermore, he's contained in this case. And what he had in there were the ashes of the last veteran of the Hampshire Regiment from the Great War. This was George Aquila Louth of the 15th Battalion of the Hampshire Regiment, which was a Portsmouth POWs battalion who'd fought on the Somme in 1916. Now, he'd passed away the previous April, and it was his wish that his ashes be scattered at a specific place on the Somme battlefields. And this was the other problem they had. They weren't sure where that place was. Did I know it? And the place was Factory Corner. Now, this is a road junction just outside of the village of Flers. The 15th Hampshire Regiment were in the 41st Division, and they had captured the ground around Flers in the Battle of Flers-Courcelette on the 15th September 1916. And I knew that his battalion had advanced beyond the village up towards the area around Factory Corner, and it transpires that he'd got there with two of his comrades. They'd dug in near to Factory Corner, and then following German counterattacks the next morning, he was the only one that was left. So he'd asked for his ashes to be scattered there to rejoin his comrades. So I got on to the mayor of Flers, who I knew very well, and she arranged a little party to come from the village. We had a small ceremony at the memorial to the 41st Division in the village, which is a monument with that very fine bronze figure of a British Tommy on the top. And then we went out to Factory Corner, and the group assembled there. And one of the party had brought with him a silver bugle from the Museum of the Hampshire Regiment, and he'd found in their archives that the 15th Hampshires had their own bugle call that had last been sounded when the battalion had been disbanded in 1918, and he stood there and played that bugle call as the ashes of George Louth were scattered across the battlefield where he'd fought in 1916. And even thinking about that now and remembering that occasion, it kind of makes the hairs stand up on the back of my neck. It was quite something to see that, quite something to say goodbye to a veteran in that way. Although I wrote down the details of who that veteran was, somewhere along the line that disappeared into the files of the archives of the old front line, and I'd misplaced it. But this May I went on a little trip to Winchester, a fantastic city. I had a great break there with lots of Great War connections in and around, not just in the cathedral, but in the old Peninsula Barracks. There's some great regimental museums there, including the Regimental Museum of the Hampshire Regiment. And I went there, and it's a fantastic little museum with a huge amount of artifacts and models covering both World Wars, and free to go into. Nice little shop where you can buy some books, postcards. And the curator came out, and I said, I've got a question for you. I don't know if you'll be able to answer this, but do you know the name of the last Great War veteran of the Hampshire Regiment? He would have died around about 2000. And she went away and came back. She said, not only do I know the name, but I can show you a photograph of him. And she took me around into one of the galleries, and there was a photograph of him taken in the late 90s. So after all those years, having wondered time and again in the back of my mind as to who this man was, there he was, not just his name, but a photograph of him. And again, kind of one of the things that I've realised about spending 4 decades of my life following the Great War around all over the place is how these stories crisscross at different points, often when you are least expecting them. Sometimes, and I've said this to many of my friends who feel the same way, we don't find these stories, we don't find these connections, they find us. And that is another fantastic part of having an interest in a subject like this. But the time when you could take the sons and the daughters of men who died in the Great War to visit their fathers' graves, and the time when the last ashes of veterans of the Great War were being scattered, I mean, that's 20 odd years ago now. It's changed since then, but that does not make visiting battlefields with groups any less powerful. It was really interesting during the Great War centenary how many people came across to visit a particular grave or a particular name on a memorial on the anniversary of that soldier having been killed 100 years before, and what it meant to them. And even post-centenary, those connections remain strong. On one of my recent tours to the Somme battlefields, a couple of people with connections to Wales asked me to take them to Mametz Woods, and although they had no family connection to the battle there, coming from the places where the men who'd fought in the wood in July 1916 came from, they felt a strong connection to those soldiers of the Welsh Regiment, the South Wales Borderers and the Royal Welsh Fusiliers who fought there more than 105 years ago. And we stood there on the actual anniversary of the first attack on the 7th of July as the waves of Welshmen crossed over the high ground down into the valley, soon to become known as Death Valley, attacking a promontory of the wood known as the Hammerhead. And those kind of experiences on these tours, as a guide, that's what brings them alive. That's what makes them special. That's how we remember the tours that we do. And for the people on the tours, that's what they take away, that powerful connection to the Great War, a connection really only possible through walking those battlefields, seeing those battlefields, and touching those battlefields on that landscape of the First World War. One of the other aspects of my 40 years on the old front line was when I lived on the battlefields. As I mentioned earlier in the podcast, I went across to the Somme to do the research for a book I wanted to write called Walking the Somme, and intended to stay there for 3 months and ended up staying for more than a decade. And living in that small Somme village of Courcelette, right in the heart of the Somme battlefields, right on the Western Front, really opened up a completely different dimension to my connection to the Great War and my understanding of that landscape of the Great War as well. Because I lived for a decade in the space of the Great War, the space once occupied by that conflict. And I know that it changed me in so many ways and changed the way in which I thought about the conflict, in a way that you can only do so by being there continuously, by being there all the time. And despite what many people probably think, it wasn't a continuous holiday. I was living and working and raising a family while I was there. So it was normal life, but with the Great War battlefields all around you as well. And so kind of Sunday afternoon walks were up to Regina Trench or Courcelette Cemetery or Adanac or around the village or whatever. But what it meant was that being there all the time, that when a kind of query came up in your head or when you wanted to go and do something, you could just go off and you could find that place or walk that place or visit that location. And just driving around places, seeing the landscape at different times of year, seeing how the weather changed the landscape, how fog would collect in different parts of fields, itself kind of exposing the undulations of the ground caused by the bombardments of the Great War, seeing how the plough at certain times of year, particularly on battlefields like the Somme and Arras and Cambrai, and then from a distance looking at those ploughed fields, you could see the ghost-like marks of the trenches which once had cut across that ground. The first winter that I spent in France, it dropped to minus 25 on the Somme that winter. That was the coldest weather that I'd ever experienced, and is true to this day. And that was similar to the conditions that the soldiers had had during the winter of 1916-17, when it had been so cold on that Somme front that men had literally frozen to death. So again, those kind of things gave insights into the war that you couldn't get by just reading a book or making the occasional visit once or twice a year. Putting your feet firmly on that landscape of the Great War of the Western Front really took you down paths that you didn't even know existed. And through being able to speak French and talking to locals, something that I realised from my very earliest trips to the battlefields is that local knowledge, local intelligence trumped everything, because you could meet someone who could then tell you that there was a bunker in a wood or a set of trenches in a valley or whatever it was. And living there and talking to people and getting to know people in the village, you then uncover locations that were really only known to the people who lived there, and it was part of their everyday lives. And that aspect as well of talking to ordinary French people in particular, to see how they thought about living on a battlefield, was another interesting aspect of it, because for them it was ordinary. It was part of their lives, the fact that there were cemeteries and memorials, and the fact that they worked in fields where ordnance from the First World War would come to light on a regular basis. They took all that for granted. They lived with it. But what I found as well was a great appreciation of the sacrifice that Britain and the Commonwealth had made during the Great War. The village where I lived at Courcelette, the mayor, Monsieur Gans, had big connections with the Australian War Memorial, and one of the things that he used to do every year was to receive a group from the Australian War Memorial making their annual battlefield tour, and he'd do a little reception for them in the village hall, and he conscripted us, to my family, myself and my family, to go in there and kind of translate for him, really, but take a little display of Great War artefacts. And we got to know a lot of Australians who came over on a regular basis, and people like Peter Burness, fantastic author of the Great War, wrote some really first-class books on Gallipoli, and he would come over with his colleagues just in advance of the tour, come and stay with us for a few days, and then we'd go off and visit some amazing locations connected to the First World War. One of his colleagues turned up once with a bucket full of panoramic photographs of the battlefields taken by an Australian photographer in 1919, and then we went out and did some then and nows using a modern version of one of these cameras and things like that. That was fascinating to do. And that period in the 90s saw a great advancement in the marking of Australian sacrifice on the battlefields of the Western Front. For Australia previously, it had all been about Gallipoli. 8,500 Australians killed at Gallipoli, but 45,000 on the Western Front. Really, that was their main theatre of war in the First World War. And at that time, the Australian government was trying to bridge that gap of understanding within Australia and mark its presence on those battlefields by the placement of memorials, and also a project which eventually became the Monash Centre at Villers-Bretonneux to create an Australian visitor centre on the battlefields of the First World War. And I found myself being involved in that as well, which was a fascinating project and process to be involved in for the acquisition of sites like the Hamel, for example. But some of the key moments, and there were so many that I could fill a book and possibly one day will do so, but some of the key moments really were some of the simple things that really happened often by chance. So there was an occasion in which one night there was a knock on the door, the front door of our house, and one of the local farmers was standing there with a steel helmet with a skull in it. And he just recovered this from a bank at the back of Courcelette where they were doing some banking work, where they were clearing some trees away and flattening out the bank. And he came along and he said, "We've just found this. There's obviously the remains of a soldier there. Could you come down and assist?" So we went down there, and in those days there was a chief exhumations officer of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, as I think there still is now. He couldn't come down immediately. He said, "If they've recovered some of the remains, could you recover them yourself and take them and store them at home until we can come and collect them tomorrow, just so that they don't get damaged or destroyed, or even worse, get stolen?" And you might think, listen to this, steal human remains? Well, there have been occasions in which bodies have been found, placed to one side by workers so the commission could come down and recover them, but a local collector had moved in and removed them before the commission had even had a chance. Terrible, absolutely awful, but it had happened. So we went down there, and most of the remains of this soldier had been recovered. There was a few artifacts. By the look of the injuries on the body, he'd sustained the loss of an arm and a leg. They'd removed his tunic, because there were no tunic buttons or shoulder titles or anything like that, possibly to get at the arm wound. There were shirt buttons and bits of his braces and things like that. And there was a Canadian button that identified him as a Canadian soldier, which, of course, on the battlefields of Courcelette is not an unsurprising thing. 8,500 Canadians had been killed there, 6,000 of them missing. So he was one of the missing. Whoever he was, his name would be inscribed on the Vimy Memorial. And we took the soldiers' remains back to our house and stored them there until the next day the commission came and recovered them. And he was then eventually reburied as an unknown Canadian soldier in Courcelette British Cemetery. And when I look back on that, I realised how privileged we were to take care of him for the nights. He was probably the most honoured guest that I will ever have in any house that I ever live in. He was someone's son, someone's brother, someone's child, someone's loved one. Someone cared about him. And then, nearly a century later, he was lost and then found. And although his identity was never established, he was buried with full military honours in a cemetery alongside his comrades. He'd been brought in from the cold by the excellent work that the Commonwealth War Graves Commission do. But as I say, talking to locals, that was when you began to find out about things that you didn't really realise were even there. I was talking for a ceremony that was coming up to the former mayor of Guillemont on the Somme, Guillemont's, and he happened to mention that he had some German bunkers on his land. So we went along with a ladder, and they're in a field in what is now, I think, Rue Ernst Junger, in Guillemont, named after the German soldier author who wrote about that part of the battlefields. And it's a three-chambered bunker built by the Germans, probably as a signals or headquarters bunker. There were a couple of entrances, kind of dome-shaped entrances to it, with steps originally, wooden steps going down into it. They'd long since disappeared, which is why we had Monsieur Dazin's ladder. And we put the ladder down there, went down into it, and it was a brick-lined bunker. It might have been an extension of a cellar of a house that was there. But again, going underground like this into literally that space of the Great War where soldiers had lived and slept and carried out their duties, it's an incredible experience. You can almost smell the First World War in places like that. And following the capture of Guillemont village by the British, it had then been used by them because on one bit of concrete wall, which was quite smooth, they'd written notes in filled pencils indicating that it was being used by them as a battalion signals post. So there were these echoes of the First World War. You know, we often talk, as we have on this podcast, about reaching out and touching history. This was very much like that. And it wasn't always underground as well. A friend of mine's brother farmed not far from Peronne, and he said, we have a shooting lodge in our woods there, where it was ground used by both sides in the Great War, and not just British and Commonwealth troops, but Americans as well. And he said they've left their mark. So he took me down to these woods in the vast open fields beyond Peronne up towards the Hindenburg line, and there was this octagonal-shaped stone structure, which was the old hunting lodge of that particular wooded area. And in there on its walls, its plaster walls, were the names of British soldiers, of Australian soldiers, of German soldiers, and indeed American soldiers. And quite a lot of men from the British Tank Corps who'd had a depot in the wood and had done a lot of mechanical repairs to tanks in that area. And this particular chap, a farmer, was also a bit of a collector, and he'd gone out on his ground and metal detected and found big chunks of tanks and tank tracks and all sorts of other artefacts from that area, which he had in a little private museum on his farm. And this was another aspect of what I discovered by living there, is that there were hundreds of these private museums. Wherever you went, you met someone who farmed on a particular area, lived in a particular area, and then went out and recovered the detritus of war from that particular area and created their own little mini museum. And some of them were just like a little shed in a garden. Others were houses full of this stuff. And I mean, there was a guy at Ypres who had over 30,000 objects in his house connected to the First World War, which he'd recovered from a kind of small area around his village. And a lot of them were the kind of usual objects, bits of gas mask and bayonets and rifles and machine guns and helmets and water bottles and entrenching tools, but a lot of personal things you'd discover in these private museums as well. Identity discs, artifacts with soldiers' numbers and names on them and so on, connecting them to real people. And I remember meeting a collector up at Lewes. He was a retired miner who lived near to the Hohenzollern Redoubt. I met him through my old friends Wayne and Michelle Young. And he'd been out walking in the fields there for decades and decades, and he had biscuit tins full of cap badges and shoulder titles. And when we got them out to have a look at them, he had, for example, the entire order of battle of the 46th North Midland Division in cap badges and shoulder titles. All of the units that had taken part in the attack on the Hohenzollern Redoubt on the 13th of October 1915 were represented in the badges that he'd found on that part of the battlefield. So these artifacts in themselves talk very strongly, very loudly of the history of the Great War. They're not just a badge or a button or a knife or a helmet. They all help tell the story of that part of the Great War landscape. And I think whether it was a name on a wall, a soldier's initials scratched into a building somewhere, or the chance to go underground on the Western Front or see one of these many private, amazing collections of Great War artifacts, that was all part of how living on that landscape of the Great War for a decade changed me. It changed my view of the Great War. It changed my understanding of the Great War. And it helped me really formulate how I feel and how I see the battlefields of that period today. And I feel and will always feel both lucky and privileged to have been able to do it. When I look back over 40 years on the old front line, one of the things that people often ask me is, what are my favourite places? Where do I like to go to? I mean, where do I even begin with something like that? Many of you will have seen my photographs of Courcelette British Cemetery at different times of the year, whether it's in the snow or under an autumn sky or summer clouds. That is a place that will forever, not just because I live there, but because of its unique location and the winding path up to the cemetery and the stories of many of the men who were buried in there, who I have connections to. That will always remain at the top of my list of special places on the Western Front. But there are so many, and we could fill dozens of podcasts. And in some respects, that is what we have been doing since I began this podcast, by talking about some of my favourite places on the Western Front. But if I was to talk about a few now in terms of places that I found particularly interesting over these 4 decades, we'll start with the end of the conflicts in November 1918, not at Mons, but on the Sambre Canal. That particular battlefield has always fascinated me, with Wilfred Owen being killed at Oars. But when you walk along that canal, the Sambre Canal, and see all the different sectors where British troops went over the top, on the 4th of November 1918, more men went over the top than on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, but far fewer were killed. The war had changed, evolved. It was a modern war by then, a war of movement, much more like the Second World War than what we normally see the First World War to be. And one of the places I particularly like going to there is Lock Number 1 at Bois de l'Abbaye. And this was where the 2nd Battalion, the Royal Sussex Regiment, made their attack on the 4th of November 1918. And it was of interest to me because one of the veterans I knew, Josh Grover, who'd won the military medal serving with the Royal Sussex Regiment, that's where he went over the top as a Lewis machine gunner in that attack. Now, this was not trench warfare, and what you can do today, it's pretty much unchanged, the landscape there. You can walk the route of their attack from the nearby village of Regé de Beaulieu. You can walk down the tracks to where they formed up either side of the track, walked across a kind of fenland towards a ditch in front of the canal. They had Royal Engineers attached to them with bridges that laid bridges over the ditches. That got them up to the edge of the canal itself. There was a lock there, a lock in the canal. The lock gates were a potential passage across, but the engineers had brought drop bridges to go over the canal itself to enable the men to advance. There was a lockkeeper's house there, which the Germans were defending, and had a machine gun in it, and the machine gun was laying down fire on the Royal Sussex men and the engineers as they moved up to that part of the canal. And when you walk there today, like I say, it's pretty much unchanged. The lockkeeper's house is the original one that was there in 1918. The lock is pretty much unchanged, and you can see that landscape. And there are some great wartime photographs taken by an official photographer showing this part of the battlefield, so you can do some really great then and nows as well. And when I stand there on the lock gates and think of Josh Grover, he went over and a bullet struck his machine gun, putting it out of action and stopping him from taking much part in the offensive that day, but he crossed over. And I think that this was kind of the final moment of the war, 1 week before the war came to an end, and this was the last great battle of the First World War, in terms of scale, in terms of size, and in terms of the number of men that were involved in it. So it's an important part of the battlefield, and a place literally where you can reach out, as we've said several times already in this podcast, reach out and touch history. That's a really important part of what you get from battlefield visits like this. But not just the Western Front, Gallipoli. I made my first trip there with my old pal John Dray. His nephew was the head gardener at the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and we applied for permission to stay in the CWGC base camp at Anzac. And it was a great experience to stay there in a kind of colonial lodge which had no electricity. It was gas lights, gas fridge, and a gas-powered shower. Quite primitive, but great, but overlooking Anzac Beach, where the Australians and New Zealanders had landed on the 25th of April 1915. And to walk those battlefields and to stay right on those battlefields was really something special. There's a promontory in the cliffs there that looks like one of the sphinxes in Egypt that the men had seen when they'd been training there, and it was known as the Sphinx. And to see the evening light go across that kind of orangey, sandy coloured soil there is really quite something. But more so was the opportunity in the evenings of just walking onto the beach at Anzac and just sitting there And as the tide washed in and out, detritus, just like the fields of the Somme in Ypres, detritus of the Great War came to light. Fragments of rum jar, 303 rounds in the sand, and bits of barbed wire and other military equipment. But sitting there and looking down the beach and watching the sun melt into the Aegean Sea, a view that soldiers would have had in 1915, it was really one of those moments in which you totally and completely connect with that landscape. You're seeing something that they saw nearly 100 years before as it was then. And it reminded me of that poem that talks about the great battalions living by the shore, and the great battalions are the dead of the 1915 campaign who occupy the cemeteries. And I could look to my right and my left and I could see those burial grounds. Men from Australia, men from New Zealand, British soldiers buried side by side in these cemeteries beneath the cliffs they tried to take in 1915. It was one of those perfect moments on the battlefield of the Great War when all of those aspects came together, what the landscape means today and what it means when we look at that generation who took part in those battles of the First World War. And I've been lucky too, which we've discussed on this podcast previously, to be involved in archaeology of the First World War. I'm not an archaeologist, I'm an historian, but archaeologists and historians often work side by side. And I saw the early work of battlefield archaeology by the diggers around Bosinger in the early 2000s, and then watched that develop into conflict archaeology carried out by fantastic archaeologists like Simon Verdigam. And to see and to witness the work that he did at Messines 10 years ago now, in 2012, when the water main was put all around the village and Simon and his team were working one step ahead of it, recovering German trenches, getting into German bunkers, recovering the dead, finding tunnel systems and huge amounts of artefacts from that period, which told us the story of the battles around Messines in the First World War. Again, that's all part of the privilege that I've had to be able to witness projects like this, to be involved in projects like this, and to make those projects available to a wider audience, working with my old pal, in this case John Hayes Fisher, to make Tunnels of Death, which was shown on British television at that time and which is still available on Apple TV, I discovered the other day through a tweet. But often what draws me back to places are the personal stories of individuals, and if I was to describe a walk coming from the Newfoundland Park on the Somme towards the village of Auchanvillers, and then a little green cemetery sign would come up on the right, and a tarmac track would take us up over the ridge, Hawthorne Ridge, out towards the vast open fields in front of Beaumont Hamel, and there towards the wooded area of the Hawthorne Crater, we'd see two almost identical trees with a cross of sacrifice in the middle. That would take us to Hawthorne Ridge number 1 Cemetery, where dear Eric Heaton is buried. I knew Eric's sister. I've mentioned her and his story in previous podcasts. But he was a young man, aged only 20, who in the nearby village of Ocean Villas, on the eve of the Battle of the Somme, wrote a letter home to his family. If he was killed, this letter was to be sent to them, and sadly killed he was. And in the letter he tells them how proud he was to have served with his men, what it was to have grown up in such a wonderful family and what they meant to him, and that if he died, if he fell, and things should not be black to them, then they would always be living in his memory. It's incredible when you read that last letter home. It's a classic last letter home. And Eric moved with his men to take part in the attack on the Hawthorne Ridge and the Hawthorne Crater, moved up through the long grass on the ridge, and was last seen leading his men towards the mine crater. His body wasn't found until the Battle of the Somme was over. The family, in agony for 4.5 months, hoped beyond hope that he might still be alive somewhere, but he wasn't. He died on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the 1st of July 1916, and he's buried here in what is a communal grave, which is why there's multiple names on the headstones, on the site where they'd fallen comrades side by side, what Martin Middlebrook calls a comrade cemetery. Very much this is the epitome of that. And placed against his headstone, and thanks to all of you who visit Eric's grave on a regular basis, who photograph it for me and send me a tweet with a picture of it, there's a little plaque against the grave there that was laid by the family in 1919, and I have a photograph of them there. The parents, his father was a vicar, his mother, his sister Irene, who I knew, and the photograph was taken by his brother, who was an army chaplain in the Great War. And there they are in this desolate landscape where there's nothing left except these wooden crosses marking the graves of Eric and his comrades who had fallen there on the first day of the Somme. Irene has her head bowed low in mourning for her lost brother. And it's in places like this that those criss-cross paths of the Great War, the echoes of the voices of all of those who were here, of the families that suffered so terribly when young men like Eric were killed. This is where it all meets, standing here on the Hawthorne Ridge, looking out across the trees of the mine crater, down towards the sunken lane. We can see the crosses of sacrifice of other cemeteries on the Redan Ridge, and beyond that the ground at Sayre, where men from Barnsley and Bradford and Hull and Leeds died in such great numbers in 1916. Here we can sense a connection to history, that history is not just a word on a page, but is real. And here, even after countless trips over these 40 years of visiting these battlefields, I can stand by Eric's grave and I can feel the power of these places, the power of the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.